G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to try and help you solve your thoracic outlet syndrome. And the way that I'd like to do this is I not only want to give you some exercises that you can do that will hopefully help your symptoms, but I want to use my experience as a physiotherapist to help you better understand why it happened and what the bigger picture might be that you need to change in order to give yourself the best chance for those symptoms to go away quickly and to stay away long term. So let's get into it. So the first thing that we need to go through in order to best help you resolve that thoracic outlet syndrome is we need to get a good understanding of what it is. And obviously, if you have symptoms associated with thoracic outlet syndrome, you'll know very well the classic sort of pins and needles, tingling, numbness, even discoloration, achiness, pain that goes down into your arm, potentially your hands and fingers. And what you may also understand is that dysfunction of that thoracic outlet, where the nerves come through that supply the tissue into your arm, hands and fingers, there's peripheral dysfunction from a more central cause. But if you have first rib dysfunction, or you have dysfunction where the neural tissue exits the neck and upper back at the spine, then you could very easily be missing the bigger picture that has asked the tissue at that thoracic outlet to become dysfunctional. So with that in mind, the first exercise that we're going to get to is an exercise that helps you mobilize any restrictions or stiffnesses or dysfunctions through the first rib that could not only be contributing to your thoracic outlet syndrome from underneath, but also be causing some dysfunction at the origin and making that whole environment less optimal than it could be. So as mentioned, the first exercise that we want to get to looks something like a first rib mobilization, but we're also going to join in with that some neck and upper back joint mobility exercise as well, to try and make that whole junction at the base of your neck, the top of your upper back, and the top of that rib area function better, move better, and hopefully create that better environment to optimize that thoracic outlet function, and hopefully all the tissue that exits from that and goes down into your arm. And as I always like to do, we can use something as simple as a lacrosse ball or a tennis ball or something like that. And the idea here is that we want to make sure that we respect how your symptoms feel to begin with. So please take note of where you feel your symptoms day to day, which fingers, what part of your hand, do you feel it down through your forearm? Is it an achiness? Is it pins and needles? Is it numbness? Is it a weakness that you feel? Try and capture how that feels in the moment before you do this so that we have something to immediately compare it to once you've done the exercise to see if anything has genuinely changed. And again, as we always do, if we can take that ball, we want to basically start by putting the ball on the biggest bump at the base of your neck. This essentially signifies the last level of your neck before it goes to your upper back. Obviously, the first rib attaches to the level directly below that. But if you can start with the ball on that bump and then let the ball roll just off to the side that you have your symptoms as a starting point. And as we always do, we want to get you to lie down on the ball. You can obviously do this sitting up against a wall or standing up against a wall if it's more convenient and comfortable for you. But essentially, all we want to keep doing with this exercise is once you've found the bump in the middle, you've rolled straight off to the side, we want to go looking for some restrictions through the joints of your neck and upper back and rib cage when we get down there. And in order to understand what that might feel like, what you need to do is you need to compare how stiff, tight, restricted, thick, hard, or dense your symptomatic side feels and compare that to the opposite side as well. Because one of the tricky things about thoracic outlet syndrome is that the side that we need to mobilize and free up may be the opposite side to the side that you have your symptoms. So if we can put your symptoms aside for a second and just specifically look at which side of your neck, the base of your neck, feels the hardest, the stiffest, and the tightest. Again, not necessarily the most tender. You can have all of your tenderness on one side, especially your symptomatic side. But again, it's where the restrictions and the handbrakes are underneath that we need to put work into to give us the best chance of normalizing the function of your neck, upper back, and eventually that thoracic outlet. So once again, once you've determined which side feels the hardest and the stiffest or the thickest, we just want to get you to let the ball gently press in there, and then with your arm, we can lift your arm up above your head and then use movement through your arm to try and shear free some of the restrictions through the base of your neck. If we move down below that main bump onto your thoracic spine, and if we come off to the left, my left, I'm now on the thoracic rib joint, have your arm up, and then just gently work in and out of that range as far as you feel comfortable, knowing that the more you do this, the further and further into that range your shoulder will go, which means we're shearing free some of the stiffnesses and the tightnesses in these upper back joints. So again, here, I feel like I start here, I sort of reach my limit, but as I use my arm to oscillate in and out of that end range. I'm just slowly shearing free some of those joints in that upper back. Now, as I mentioned before, thoracic outlet syndrome is very closely associated with that first rib dysfunction. So if we can come back up to that first rib area, so again, just below the main bump, off to the side is the thoracic spinal joint. Out further towards your shoulder blade is going to be the first rib itself. We want to create that same situation that we did before. This feels a little bit tighter and more restricted for me. If for you it feels quite tender, then obviously please be respectful and gentle. Just gently oscillate in and out of that end range, knowing that it will start to shear free and free up and go further the more and more you do this. Once you've had enough of that first rib, move it down to the second rib. Same process, see if you can find some restrictions and then consistently work lower and lower and lower until you can get your arm essentially touching the ground without bending your elbow. And as I mentioned, although thoracic outlet syndrome is very closely related to first rib dysfunction, we don't want to look at you just as a first rib in isolation, because if the second rib, the third rib are also stiff, tight and restricted, it's still creating a suboptimal environment. It still has the potential to pull a bunch of slack out of the system and still feed into the symptoms that you may be experiencing. And once you've been able to locate and potentially improve some of that hidden joint dysfunction in your neck and upper back, we also want to make sure that we give you some really gentle stretches through your scalene muscles and through your pec tissue, muscles that anchor onto those ribs, so that again we can take some of the handbrakes off that might be feeding into that thoracic outlet syndrome and feed some slack back into that system and hopefully take some of the pressure off those structures. So when trying to understand how tight your scalene muscles are and trying to successfully mobilize them, it's a relatively straightforward process. We know that your scalenes attach from your neck and anchor down onto the top few ribs of your rib cage. And depending on how symptomatic you feel at the moment, the first step can be to sit on the hand on the side that you're trying to stretch. What this tends to do is it tends to depress or drop that shoulder girdle, creating some immediate lengthening and tension through those scalenes. But as we'll get to a little bit later on, if dropping that shoulder does exacerbate your symptoms, then don't worry about sitting on your hand. But for those who can currently tolerate it, you sit on your hands, let that drop a little bit, gently tilt your head away from the side that you're trying to stretch. We can get you to look up or look down a little bit to capture which part of those scalene muscles feel the tightest for you. You can certainly rotate gently a little bit as well with that flexion and extension, just to find the best version of the stretch for you. Now, the really important part of stretching any tissue that I'm trying to promote really heavily on this channel is that the days of just statically holding that stretch are hopefully behind us. What we need to do instead is you need to put your neck into a position that generates the tightness that you're looking for, and then you need to tense up that tightness for 5 to 10 seconds. You can reach over and use your hand just to gently apply a little bit of extra tension, but to also provide a block for you to push your head back into activating those tight scalene tissues. It should give a little bit, and then you should immediately feel that you can go further into the stretch than you could before. And then if we can squeeze that tissue again, repeat the same process for 5 to 10 seconds, then keep going further and further and further into the stretch for as long as you feel you can handle it, and then come back and get a sense of how tight that feels and what effect that might be having on your thoracic outlet symptoms. And if you want a little bit more detail on how to permanently loosen tight scalene muscles, I recently put out a video on that very topic, so please check that out after this video if that's of interest to you as well. So as mentioned, once you've been able to mobilize some tight scalene tissue, we also want to go looking for some of the pec muscle tissue that may also be tight because it attaches to those first few ribs. And again, as I've spoken about on the channel, pec tightness on its own, much like scalene tightness on its own, should be considered symptoms of something else. Our brain uses muscular tissue to help support and protect other things. And this is the reason why we want to go after the joint dysfunction first, because those joints and those ribs are the deepest structures that these muscles anchor to. So if those joints become dysfunctional, then again, it gives reason for these muscles to be tight. And one of the misconceptions about pec muscle tightness is that pec muscle tightness is an issue in its own right. And while you can definitely mount a case that it is, often pec muscle tightness, whether it's the pec major or the pec minor underneath, because they anchor to the rib cage, they are at the mercy of how well your rib cage is functioning. So again, if we do these mobility drills for your pec, but you aren't freeing up the corresponding rib joints and spinal joints around the back, then you may never resolve that chest muscle tightness for good. And then when you come to look for strategies to mobilize tight pec muscles, we can obviously do things like pec muscle stretches. But for the purposes of this video, I want to show you how to mobilize tight pec tissue with a ball. Again, you can use a tennis ball if this feels a little bit too aggressive for you. But all we're looking for is anywhere from about sort of your nipple level up in towards that sort of triangle where your shoulder anchors into your collarbone. We want to go looking for anything that feels immediately thick, tight, and obviously tender. Now, if your thoracic outlet syndrome symptoms are a little bit flared at the moment, we obviously need to be very respectful and very careful how we do this, just so you're not irritating something that's already irritated. But essentially how this looks is all we need is a ball, we need a door frame or a wall of some sort. We're gonna place the ball right up in there, and then we want to lean into the wall and gently let the ball press into that tissue. And then much like we did with the ball into the neck, we can use movement to shear free some of that restricted tissue. You should feel like there's a nice little stretch. You can feel some tension through those pec muscles. You can also turn your palm up and come out into this position to stretch it out in this plane. But essentially, whatever direction you go, whether it's behind you, whether it's out to the side, or even above your head, we're looking to keep some constant pressure and constant tension on the ball. And we're going to use movement to shear that tissue free. And then once you've sort of systematically worked your way around that, you should automatically feel that it's looser and freer than what it was before. But then once you've mobilized those stiff underlying joints and you've freed up the scalenes and the pec tissue that anchors onto those ribs, we now just want to have a conversation about what strength exercises you might be able to do to help support that thoracic outlet syndrome. So when turning to strength exercises to improve your thoracic outlet syndrome, one really important exercise that I would ask you to consider is a shrug. And in the next section, we'll get to why this is really important. But shrugging tends to counteract one of the main causes for why thoracic outlet syndrome develops in the first place. So what I would like you to do is if you can grab a resistance band of some sort. This is just a power band that I broke the other day. You can use a TheraBand, you can use weights, you can use whatever you feel, shopping bags, a bar, whatever you've got. But all we want you to do is to, in my case, stand on the band and have enough tension to make this interesting. Being up nice and tall, shoulders comfortably back. We just want you to lift your shoulders up as high as you feel comfortable and then come down back to neutral. We don't want you to poke your chest out. We don't want you to lift your arms up and then poke your chin out just to make it easier for you to get up as high as we want you to. Keep your spine nice and still and just have your shoulders come up and down as far as you feel able to, keeping your symptoms in mind. Now, to make things a little bit harder, instead of having your hands by your side, you can have your arms away from your side a little bit. It'll just add to the challenge of how this feels for you. And it obviously goes without saying that you can make the exercise harder again by adding more resistance, whether it's grabbing the band a little bit lower, adding more weights if you're using weights. We're just looking for a very healthy dose of fatigue after about 8 to 12 reps. And standard strength protocols, if you do that 3 times, we need to get you to experience some fatigue through your upper traps and potentially those same scalene muscles to tell your brain that they aren't necessarily good enough for what we want them, so that when you go to sleep, it recovers and it comes back stronger the next day. But we want to make sure that we can strengthen some of those scalenes and some of those upper trap muscles that sit over the top of that thoracic outlet to help us optimize how that entire area functions, not just the opening that those vessels pass through that might be getting compromised. And once you feel very confident with your shrugs, it may certainly be beneficial for you to look at certain strength exercises for your neck specifically. I have another video that goes through some very simple basic neck strength exercises that may also be helpful for you specifically. But as I mentioned before, once you've spent the time finding those underlying hidden joint restrictions and you've successfully freed up some of the musculature over the top and been able to fatigue it enough that you start to develop more strength in the area, we now need to turn our attention to why we're having this conversation in the first place. Because if we don't change that or improve that or optimize that in some way, then it is genuinely unrealistic to expect this to go away easily and permanently. So while you're spending your time mobilizing and strengthening relevant areas, probably the most important conversation that we need to have is that we need to have a conversation about why those specific parts of your body have become stiff, tight, and potentially weaker. And if you've been a follower of the channel, you'll know where I'm about to go with this. But the single most important thing that I think most people need to pay attention to are the basic shapes, postures, and positions you put your neck and upper back into the most consistently throughout the day. And as always, the reason for this is that you can have the best thoracic outlet treatment known to man, but if you aren't also pairing that up with a conversation around where your postures and shapes aren't perfect, then you may be missing the single biggest reason for why it's there, but also why it hasn't naturally gone away on its own. And the reason why this is so important is that if you've taken the time with the ball to find where through the base of your neck, where in your upper back, where through your rib cage, you have developed the most stiffness, tightness, and restriction. But more importantly, once you have released some of that restriction and you hopefully feel some resolution or improvement in your symptoms to justify that, then there has to be a reason why that exact part of your body has become stiff, tight, and dysfunctional, and open up the door for something like thoracic outlets to come through. And again, in my clinical experience, when you sit someone down and start talking about the shapes and postures that you put that tissue into from the moment that you wake up to the moment that you fall asleep, the common things that we often arrive at are the boring things. Things like how you sit at a desk, how you sit in your car, how you sit on your comfortable couch watching TV at the end of the day, how you sit up in bed reading a book. If you're someone who plays an instrument, you do arts and crafts. If you just love to read, they're all valid things to do. And we're not trying to rob you of your enjoyment or your comfort. But what we do need to pay attention to is what specific shape are you doing those things in? And one of the classic examples for myself is if you're someone who works at a desk and the symptomatic side, or the side that has developed the most stiffness and tightness, happens to be the mouse hand, the hand that you use to use the mouse at work, then essentially as soon as your shoulder drops and gets pulled forwards, the weight of your limb under gravity is constantly pulling and hanging off the tissue at the base of your neck and upper back. And because your body is just an adaptive machine, it just becomes stiffer, tighter, rustier, and more restricted to help support you in your quest to do this more consistently. So if you're spending so much time mobilizing those stiffnesses and getting your muscles stronger and stretching those tight muscles as well, but then you don't resolve some of these day-to-day postures by trying to be back into a better position, then it's hard to get you off this hamster wheel forever. And if you're someone who doesn't use a computer, but you like to sit in the arm of your chair where your shoulder drops and rolls forward, or that's how you sit to drive your car, or that's how you sit to read your book, that constant shape will load your tissue up differently and abnormally enough to ask this to be here and to keep this hanging around. So it's highly important that you can take a step back, try and consider what about your day-to-day life might be feeding into this, and do something to improve that. All we need you to think of doing is just taking your shoulders comfortably back and trying to be up a little bit taller. Use pillows and cushions or lumbar rolls or supports to hold you in this position. Don't give yourself the opportunity to get dragged out of that position for long enough that your body has to adapt, because there may be a consequence attached to that given enough time. So as always, I genuinely hope that that was helpful. Not only do I hope that these exercises and ideas help you resolve your symptoms quickly, but I'm very big on perspective and context. And I hope that the perspective that I've hopefully given you today does help you better understand why your thoracic outlet syndrome may have happened in the first place, why it may not naturally have gone away, and what you hopefully need to consider aiming towards to make sure that this does go away forever long term. And if this was helpful, please let me know in the comments down below. Please leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you want more of this type of information from me. If you're struggling with thoracic outlet syndrome, I plan to have a course come out on the website, the Your Wellness website, in the short term. But if you need specific help, please consider booking in an online consultation with me, and hopefully we can get to the bottom of why it's there and why it might not be going away. But as always, thank you again for watching, and hope to see you next time.